Good morning, everyone. My name is Meena Bose, and I am the Executive Dean for Public Policy and Public Service Programs at Hofstra University and the Director of our Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to Hofstra virtually today for our panel on how the Office of Management and Budget will shape policy in the Biden White House. We have much to discuss today and several speakers. So let me begin. I'll keep my introduction very short so that I can turn it over to my colleagues and maximize time for our discussion. Just a few Zoom rules, if you will. We'll begin. I will ask participants to keep your microphones muted, apart from the panelists, until we move into through the event. When we begin the Q&A, we will open the chat, and I'll ask you to put your questions into the chat. You may send them, my students can send them, you can send them directly to me, or you can put them in, and I'm glad to ask them on behalf of everybody, and of course for everyone in the audience as well. And we'll try to get a combination of student and general audience questions. I see several, in addition to my class, I see several of our colleagues in presidency studies here, and it's our guests and university colleagues, and it's really, we're really delighted to have everyone here. Let me say, this panel is based on, delighted to share some exciting publication news on an edited volume, Executive Policymaking, the Role of the OMB in the Presidency, published by the Brookings Institution Press and edited by myself and my colleague, Andrew Rudelevich, also holding the book, and several of our panel participants, Rachel Potter, Molly Reynolds, Martha Coven, who will be joining us a little later, and then the Partnership for Public Service, for whom Troy Cribb is joining us today, have contributed to this volume. You may see, I don't know if you can see this from Zoom, but it has the picture of the White House upside down and the Office of Management and Budget, new executive office building right side up. We had quite a bit of discussion about this cover, and we said when it was selected, we thought that this is how OMB really underlies, keeps everything upright in the policymaking world. And we'll have a chance to talk a little bit about that today. While I'm tempted to actually use that as a point to get into some of the substantive material, I did promise my colleagues that they would get to summarize their work in the volume. So I'll hold off on my formal remarks from now, apart from saying that this volume is based on a symposium that we hosted at Hofstra University in April 2019. I can't tell you how often I thought it's fortunate that we hadn't planned it for April 2020, but it is that we brought together scholars of the presidency and policymaking and practitioners in OMB and national politics to discuss the evolving evolution of OMB from the Bureau of the Budget to OMB, OMB's role in policymaking, executive orders, regulations, budgetary politics, and internal management. And the edited volume addresses all of those topics. Today, we're going to focus on a selection of those topics, and our speakers, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, will discuss their areas of research, and we greatly appreciate their willingness to take the time to join us. Let me quickly say that in addition to our wonderful panelists who've taken the time to join us today, would like to thank the Brookings Institution Press for all of their work in producing this volume, for working with us, for sharing, for publicizing it. I don't want to kind of promote our volume, but I will say that we did receive a message that there is an alumni newsletter of Bureau of the Budget and Office of Management and Budget members, and we received a very nice endorsement in there that talks about chapters critically survey all aspects of OMB's responsibilities. And I think my colleague Andrew said this is the endorsement that means a lot, because we know that means that the people who do the work in OMB are persuaded by what the scholars have to say, or at least are encouraged to engage the discussion. So many thanks to Brookings, thanks to my colleagues at Hofstra, in the political science department, the dean's office, the cultural center, and thanks to my American presidency class and everyone in the audience who's taken the time to join us today. The order in which we'll speak will be the order in which I'll give the very quick introductions. My colleague, Andrew Rudelevich, who is the co-author of the volume, will begin by introducing providing an overview of the volume and discussing specifically his own work on executive orders, which is the subject of his forthcoming book, I believe is coming out this spring, Andy. Andy's the author of several other volumes, including books on legislative leadership, the new imperial presidency, and a textbook on the politics of the presidency, and is also completing a book on OMB. So we're delighted, Andy, that you're with us, able to join us today. Our next speaker will be Molly Reynolds, a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. Molly will provide the congressional perspective in the budgetary process. Molly's research focuses on congressional rules and procedures and the policy outcomes. Her recent book is titled Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate. We might get some questions from the audience about that as well, Molly, and we're so glad that you're here joining us today. Rachel Augustine Potter teaches politics at the University of Virginia, studies political institutions, regulation, public policy, public administration, and the separation of powers. Her book, Bending the Rules, Procedural Politicking in the Bureaucracy, examines how bureaucrats leverage procedures to exercise influence, and received, among other recognitions, the American Political Science Association's Best Book Award from the Presidency and Organized Politics section. So delighted to have you with us today, Rachel. Troy Cribb is the Director of Policy at the Partnership for Public Service, where she guides the partnership's development of programs and strategies for improving government management and revitalizing the federal service. Troy has worked in federal service for 2 decades, first at the General Services Administration, then at the Senate Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, and also in the Department of Commerce. Troy, we're very appreciate you taking the time to join us today. And our last speaker, Martha Coven, will be joining us a little bit later in the program as she had discussed with us. Martha teaches at Yale Law School and has taught at Princeton University as a visiting professor in the School of Public and International Affairs. She served for 6 years in the Obama White House as the Associate Director for Education, Income Maintenance, and Labor in OMB. She also served as a special assistant to the president in the Domestic Policy Council, focusing on poverty and workforce issues, and actually developed the administration's plan for reducing childhood obesity. Before working in the Obama administration, Martha spent 8 years as a legislative assistant at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and at the Consumers Union. She most recently headed OMB's transition team for then President-elect Biden. And when she joins us, she'll share some of those experiences. With that, I think I will turn the screen over to my colleague, Andrew Rudelevige. So Andy, please.
Great, Meena, thanks so much. And thanks for pulling this together. It's very timely and I hope useful to both your students, but also I see to the luminaries out in the Zoom audience today. It's wonderful to see so many of you, including at least one member of the agency review team that Martha headed. So pressure's on here on the panel to get this right. So I'm going to share my screen quickly, I hope. And if all is well, you can now see the OMB in overview, which is the idea here of the thing. I'm trying to do this in 7 minutes in order to make sure, as Professor Bose told me, set a good example. So we're going to work on this. So I'm going to, again, give an overview of the agency very quickly, talk a little bit about executive orders, but we can come back to that in more detail as we move through. Most generally, OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, has key roles in budget development, oversight. It houses a lot of policy expertise and the ability to do policy analysis. It has one of the only real pools of institutional memory inside the executive office of the president, and serves as the pivot point between the White House and the wider executive branch in a number of different capacities, most notably that of central clearance. That is the ability for the president to know what the agencies are doing, whether it's in legislation, in regulation, or in the proposal of executive orders, which of course largely don't come from the White House, but from the wider executive branch. It's such an important tool that John Whitaker, who worked for Richard Nixon, said, "Thank God for Franklin Roosevelt for inventing it." Well, Franklin Roosevelt technically did not invent the Office of Management and Budget. It was actually created in 1921 as the Bureau of the Budget. It was then inside the Treasury Department, but Roosevelt did move it inside the executive office of the president in 1939 as part of Executive Order 8248. And it became part really of the president's staff, broadly conceived. It's not part of the White House staff proper, and perhaps Martha can talk a little more about that relationship, having worked on both sides of the alleyway, effectively, between the White House and the old executive office building. But it has served as an important part of the president's managerial toolbox. The management side, over time, got more stress. It was reorganized as the Office of Management and Budget in 1970 during the Nixon administration. George Shultz, who of course just passed away, was the first director of the new OMB. And it's been reorganized multiple times, sometimes by a self-study, sometimes imposed. But the last major reorg, I think it's fair to say, was part of the so-called OMB 2000 initiative in the Clinton administration in 1994, when the management parts of OMB were merged together with the budget parts, though not entirely, as I'll discuss in a minute. And that created what are known as the resource management offices, which again, we'll return to. Worth noting, just as an overview, that OMB has a budget of about $115 million. That was the president's request for fiscal year 2021, and it has approximately 500 employees. This number bounces around a little, but not much, and indeed has not increased very much over time, despite the responsibilities that have been piled upon OMB by the president and sometimes by Congress. Importantly, as noted, there is an institutional memory component. Most OMB employees are civil servants, are careerists, and that is important as well for the functioning of the agency. That was something that threatened to be undermined by the Schedule F proposal that President Trump issued as an executive order towards the end of his term that President Biden has now rescinded. That might have shifted numerous OMB employees out of the career service into political appointments, which would have made for a very different kind of agency. Just so you can picture this, right? There's the White House and the executive office building complexes. You've probably recognized the old executive office building. This is where now the Eisenhower executive office building, kind of a joke, because Eisenhower wanted to tear down the whole building, one of the few flaws on Eisenhower's records, in my view. In any case, the fancy gray building that used to hold the state war and Navy departments right next to the White House is where the political appointees, the higher levels of OMB staff, reside. The gray building, as it's called, and just north of that, the red building, which, as Meena said, is on the cover of our book, propping up the White House itself. And the careerists largely reside in the red building with a better view of the White House, depending on how close to a corner office you manage to get. So what does it look like inside? Well, again, let me just walk you through the functions of OMB quickly by looking at the org chart, right? We have the upper political leadership. This is where the Senate confirmed appointees reside. There's Neera Tanden, right, who is the nominee as director of OMB under President Biden. And she, of course, has had 2 confirmation hearings this week. And you may have seen some jousting between her and some of the members of the Senate Budget Committee yesterday, in fact, partly over policy and partly over Twitter. Her nominated deputy would be Shalonda Young, who is a longtime staffer and staff director of the House Appropriations Committee. And then there's also a deputy director for management, and the nominee there is Jason Miller, not Donald Trump's Jason Miller, but a differently and coincidentally named Mr. Miller, who had worked at the National Economic Council in the White House during the Obama administration. We jump over to the OMB-wide support offices, and here you have a variety of things, but the General Counsel's office is where review of executive orders often takes place. And yes, this is in the pre-computer era, but you can see the clearance that is given for, in this case, a sugar trade order dealing with quotas. You see it went to various agencies, they got comments, different memos, no objection, and so forth. OMB does serve as the pivot point, as I mentioned, for executive orders that are being requested both by the White House and by different executive departments and agencies. And OMB will, ask very basic questions, perhaps. Here's a draft from the White House of an executive order that starts by the authority vested in me as president. The council has asked, well, what authority exactly? That, of course, should be the first question for any executive order. Also, in the support offices, the Legislative Reference Division, which has been around since the 1930s. It was called the Division of Coordination originally. And its job is to keep track of what the agencies are proposing, what the president might want to sponsor, to clear both legislative drafts and testimony, and to make sure that things are in accord with the program of the president. They also will review bills that are in process. They'll keep track of what's happening on the floor, issue these status reports periodically throughout an administration, and compile the statement of administration policy on bills that are coming to a vote on which the administration wishes to express a view or perhaps a veto threat. And then the bulk of OMB is in the research management offices that I mentioned, right? These are where the great substance of OMB resides, and in the different offices, the different RMOs, you have budget officers as well as management specialists. You'll have seen, right, that Martha Coven was the head of this RMO, Education, Income, Maintenance, and Labor. If we were just to sort of focus on any of these, let's take health programs. There's a little bit of a hierarchy within these RMOs that you may hear reference to. The program associate director, for example, which was Martha's job, as often called the PAD. Their deputy, who is normally a careerist, known as the DAD, and then a branch chief, one for each of the branches within that division. And below them, examiners, sort of the front lines of OMB, who work with specific agencies on their budget and other issues that arise within that agency, proposals for managerial reform, proposals for new programmatic initiatives, and the like. And then finally, we have the statutory offices. These are, as you might have guessed, created in statute by Congress, sometimes with OMB's delight, sometimes with less delight. And these deal with managerial issues. And so, as I said, management was merged into the RMOs with budget. The M and the B have always had a little bit of a strange relationship, but they are separate here in government-wide issues of management, federal financial management, for example, procurement policy, e-government and IT, and very importantly, right, OIRA, Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Rachel Potter is going to talk more about this, but it is composed of desk officers whose job it is to use now 40 plus years of presidential executive orders in order to do cost benefit analysis of different regulations that are being proposed by the departments under their own statutory authority, and to make sure the president knows about them and has input upon them. So in general, right, as you look at the book, it's structured around these functions, around budgeting, around central clearance, around the interaction between the White House and OMB, and then about OMB as manager, about external management, that is its role in the wider executive branch, but also internal management as an organization in its own right. And then, of course, there's some discussion in the book about the future of OMB, which Troy will talk about a little bit later in our program. In any case, that is your whirlwind overview of OMB, and happy as we continue our conversation to return to any parts of that as my colleagues move through the different functions of the agency. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Andy, and for that very succinct presentation of quite a lot of material about the agency and its operations and our research on it. So thank you. If we turn to a perspective now, focus on the Capitol Hill's role in budgetary politics and policymaking and interactions with OMB, I'll turn to Molly Reynolds.
All right, thank you, Meena. Thank you for organizing us. Thank you, and Andy, for editing the volume. So my contribution to the volume focuses on the relationship between OMB and Congress. And there are basically 4 aspects of this relationship that I talk about in my chapter. What I'm going to do today is talk about 3 of them with a focus on kind of where we are right now with the start of the new Biden administration, and what are some things to watch for in these in this relationship in the coming year ahead. So the first thing I talk about in the chapter is the way that OMB, as the sort of chief producer in the White House of the president's budget, performs a really important agenda-setting role for Congress. When we think about that, there's lots of history of the president's budget being seen as dead on arrival, and we'll learn more over the coming year about how much the current Congress, which is obviously has both chambers controlled by the same party as the White House, how much they do with the president's budget requests, particularly in the context of the discretionary appropriations process. I'll talk more about kind of where Congress is going legislatively in a second, but I'll note that it's usually the case that in the first year of the president's term, the president's budget arrives quite late. In 2001, George W. Bush released his first budget 63 days after the statutory February deadline for doing so. In 2009, Obama released his first budget 94 days after the deadline. Trump in 2017 rolled his out in sort of 2 pieces, one in March and one in May. So I expect that while we will eventually get a first budget from President Biden, it is obviously past the deadline already, and may be a little while before we see that. I think we're going to talk a little bit later in the panel about the transition specifically from Trump to Biden, but there was some reporting late last year, early this year, that suggests that there was a lack of cooperation from the outgoing Trump administration folks at OMB, that they were not especially cooperative with the Biden transition team, which I think could delay the process of putting together that first budget as well. I mentioned that we often talk about the president's budget as being dead on arrival when it arrives on Capitol Hill. But one sort of interesting feature of the current moment is that Congress, literally as we speak, is working on an extremely large fiscal package, up to $1.9 trillion over 10 years, that will itself reflect a lot of presidential budgetary priorities. This is the reconciliation proposal that the House and the Senate are currently working on. There are obviously other components to putting together the president's budget, including the way the budget process helps the president achieve his management goals, and there's some good discussion of that in other chapters in the book. But we are, because of the sort of confluence of the need to take swift fiscal action in response to the pandemic and the the change in party control from divided government to unified party control. We're seeing sort of a somewhat unusually early glimpse at Congress acting on some presidential budget priorities. And over, I think, the coming weeks, we'll get a much clearer sense of, how closely is Congress hewing to what the president is advocating for in the budgetary arena. Another thing that I talk about in my chapter is OMB as an enforcer of Congress's budgetary choices. So Congress has repeatedly implicated OMB as the enforcer of limits that Congress has tried to put on itself. There are two important things to watch right now in this area. So one of the limits that one of the places where Congress has implicated OMB as an enforcer of its own budgetary limits is in the context of the Budget Control Act, which has for the past decade limited discretionary spending on both the defense and the non-defense sides of the discretionary budget. That's going away. This is the last fiscal year, the one that we're currently in the middle of, is the last fiscal year that the Budget Control Act applies, and it's really unclear what that will mean for the future of discretionary budgeting. This is really at its heart a congressional problem and not an OMB problem, but it is again a place where Congress has gone to OMB to try and implicate the agency in enforcing its choices that we're sort of moving away from that era. Another place where Congress has implicated OMB as the enforcer of its budgetary discipline that is we've seen some new discussion about this. We're likely to see much more. Is something called statutory pay-as-you-go or statutory pay-go, and that may be especially relevant this year. So basically, statutory pay-go is a law that provides for an across-the-board sequester or cut in many mandatory spending programs if Congress enacts deficit increasing legislation. So when Congress enacts a piece of legislation that increases the deficit, it's OMB's job to put that deficit increase on a scorecard. If Congress gets to the end of the year with that deficit still on the scorecard, then OMB executes the sequester. It makes these across the board cuts. Social Security and means tested entitlements are exempt from these cuts. Medicare is subject at a slightly lower rate, but then things like student loans and farm price supports have the potential to get hit quite heavily if we kind of reach this situation. Why does this matter right now? I mentioned before that Congress is currently working on a reconciliation bill. Budget reconciliation is a legislative process that Congress can use to do certain types of legislating in the budgetary arena, not subject to the threat of a filibuster. Reconciliation is subject to this statutory pay-as-you-go law that OMB is responsible for enforcing. So if there are deficit increases under reconciliation, Congress would either need to take subsequent action in order to take care of that statutory pay-go scorecard, or we get to the end of the year, the deficits from a potential reconciliation bill are still on the scorecard, and then we're facing this big sequester. There are procedural reasons why Congress can't kind of take care of the statutory pay-go issue in the reconciliation bill itself. And the last time this came up, 2017, Congress basically at the same time that it passed the Trump tax cuts that had big deficit implications. They also passed a separate piece of legislation that kind of cleaned up the pay-go issue. But it's like exactly, and I think probably something like that is somewhat likely to happen this year, but exactly how this shakes out is important. And again, this is just another place where the particular relationship between Congress and OMB comes into play. The third thing, and the last for the purposes of this session that I'll talk about, that I talk about in the chapter, is how Congress has in the past tried to control OMB. So Andy was mentioning before the Senate confirmable positions at OMB. So there's the director and then the deputy director and the deputy director for management. One sort of congressional quirk of the nomination process for the director and the deputy directors, that those actually have to go through 2 congressional committees. That's relatively unusual for Senate confirmed appointments. It reflects kind of the breadth of what OMB is responsible for. Andy was mentioning we've seen some contention in the hearings for Neera Tanden to be the director of OMB. From my perspective, as someone who thinks about the budget process mainly through a congressional lens, the choice of, as Andy was saying, Shalonda Young to be the deputy director is a really interesting choice from a congressional perspective. So as Andy mentioned, Young was a staffer on the House Appropriations Committee starting in 2007. And since 2017, she's been what in Appropriations Committee parlance we refer to as the chief clerk, which is basically the staff director, which meant that she's been an extremely central player in a lot of Congress's recent big budget negotiations. And so if we think about the ways in which the relationship between the White House generally and OMB specifically and Congress might look different under the Biden administration than it did under the Trump administration, I think this is a signal that the Biden team has put in place someone who has really deep and extensive congressional experience, relationships with folks on the Hill. And so that as we look at the potential for big budget negotiations now, later this year and going forward, that this is going to be a really important relationship, an important person to watch in this configuration. The last thing I talk about in the chapter, which I won't really talk too much about today, is kind of the politics of budgetary information, the way in which OMB and the Congressional Budget Office exist as kind of different wells of budgetary information in Washington. So if you want to learn more about that and that history, that's in the chapter as well. But I'll stop there and turn it back over to Meena. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Molly. And I know I was just, as you were speaking, I was looking back at the 4th point and thinking, I wish we had room to include it, but maybe we'll get to it in the discussion. So I know all of you are condensing a lot of work in a very short time. So thank you very much. Turn it over to Rachel to talk about regulations and the role of OIRA in the OMB process.
Thanks, Meena. Thanks for organizing and allowing us to have this conversation today. And it's good to see so many friends out there in the audience. So in thinking about what I wrote for this volume and how it's relevant to our conversation today, I took a historical perspective on OIRA. So OIRA is the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, if you're not familiar with it. It is the office in OIRA in OMB, as Andy mentioned, that oversees agency rulemaking. And my thinking on this as I was writing was we have almost 40 years or 40 years this year of OIRA. What can we, how can we evaluate how that agency is done or that office has done? So a lot of times if you read media accounts or even academic accounts of OIRA, it sort of has this really ominous tinge to it, right? OIRA is the killing ground for regulations. It is headed by sometimes a regulatory czar is how the administrator is described. It is the place where rules go to die. It is the most powerful office you've never heard of. There's all of these descriptions, and it makes it seem like OIRA is omnipotent, right? They can get whatever they want. They control the regulatory state. And I don't think that's an apt characterization for a lot of reasons. And so what I tried to do in thinking about this, stepping back and sort of evaluating OIRA, was think about where OIRA could be doing better. So I'm going to talk about, I lay out 4 different areas I think OIRA could improve on in the chapter, and this sort of, and I'll talk about 3 of those today, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I think the Biden team is already taking up some of these issues. So one thing that, especially for the students on this call today, is that OIRA doesn't do cost benefit analysis. Agencies do. Agencies do it and they send it over to OIRA for review. That's important because agencies are really very, very different from one another. They have very different capacities and capabilities. And so the quality of analysis in agency rulemakings over the years has varied tremendously to excellence and to not excellence, shall I describe it as. Okay, and so OIRA really can, and I think should, provide more guidance for agencies on how to do the cost benefit or regulatory impact analysis, is how we generally refer to it, how to do it better. And so the circular that guides this process for agencies. It's an OMB memo from 2003. It has not been updated. And there's just a lot of room that OIRA could be giving agencies some more guidelines on what does a good RIA look like? What are we gaining from this as a society when we push agencies to do this? Well, there's a lot of benefits, I think, to RIA generally. And so how can we do this well? If we're going to go through the motions, let's have there be a valuable product that comes out the other side. So that's one of the things I talked about, is the failure to really routinize this process for agencies, especially ones that have lower capacity. A second thing I talk about is guidance. Agencies, which is agencies write these guidance documents. They are like rules or regulations, but they're not subject to the same processes. If you try to figure out what OIRA's role in overseeing guidance has been in those 40 years, it's a little bit like whiplash. You can read it in this chapter. It's been back and forth and back and forth. Every administration has had a different policy for it. They've claimed different authority to review guidance. It has not been a systematic policy over the decades. And that's really confusing for us as the public. It's confusing for agencies if they have to do new things with every new president. And so I think there's a lot of role that OIRA can play in helping agencies decide what the process is for writing guidance, what's a good process, what's a bad process, how should we systematically, not just in this administration, but across administrations, handle this. The third thing I talk about is this idea of regulatory look back. So every new president comes in and says, I am going to get rid of the regulation that's not working. We know that some regulation is ineffective, inefficient. So my administration pledges to get the bad stuff off the books. That sounds really good, and it's probably worthwhile from a societal perspective. The way that we've done that has been different in every administration. It's not systematic. And it's a problem, again, for agencies who want to set up a process that's going to be consistent and where regulated parties can know how things might look for the longer term. That's what good governance looks like, right? If there's a lot of predictability to process. And so I talk a little bit about how OIRA could have more of a systematic role in establishing a more permanent evaluation of regulation on the books. So that's kind of what the chapter goes into. I also talk about the shortage of staff at OIRA, which is systematically a problem. There's just not enough human bodies doing this work. If we think this work is valuable, we should put our money where our mouth is. So that's the fourth thing I'm not going to talk more about. What has Biden already done? Well, on day one, I see Bridget Dooling is here. She has a great piece over at Brookings looking at actions that the Biden administration took right at the outset, revoking a lot of Trump's orders on regulation, and laying out really what we care about in this context is a new process. Not a fundamentally new process. So Biden has come out and Neera Tanden confirmed this in her hearings this week. Cost benefit analysis is here to stay. But the way we do it might look a little bit different. I think one overarching thing we can already see from the Biden administration is certainly that rulemaking and regulation are going to be central to this president's agenda. So getting the process right and establishing it in a systematic way is going to be really important. And critical, sort of from my perspective as someone who was very critical of the previous administration's roles, to OIRA's role in previous administration in overseeing cost benefit analysis, was that the modernizing regulatory review memorandum that the Biden administration put out on day one says that they're going to review circular A4. That's my timer that I should stop talking. So there is a commitment from this administration that they will reevaluate how RIA is done systematically across the agencies. And we can talk more about this in the Q&A because I think this is going to be really crucial. And you saw that in the hearings for the OMB director this week, is that there's going to be a lot more consideration of the distributional impacts of regulation to different subpopulations. Thanks.
Thank you, Rachel. And there's no need to set the timer, though we were not going to mute you. But I think you're closing comments, which we'll get to in the Q&A, but make a nice transition to Troy's commentary about the transition period and the Partnership for Public Services very significant research over the past 5 years, really. The 2016 report, which the organization kindly updated for the volume for 2020 for either possibility, second term or new administration. And, of course, the partnership has been very active, was very active in the transition period. So with that, Troy, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Meena. That was a very nice setup. So, and as Meena mentioned in the introductions, I had a long career mostly in government before coming to the partnership, including over 10 years on the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, which has jurisdiction over OMB and works very closely with them on management issues. And then when I was at GSA, I was the Associate Administrator of Government-Wide Policy, which is an arm of GSA. And for those of you who are not familiar with GSA, that's the General Services Administration. The office I led, as I say, was the policy office that works very closely with the management part of OMB. So I've seen a lot over the years related to OMB, both as from the perspective of a Hill staffer, but then also in an agency that worked very closely with OMB. So the partnerships chapter touches on OMB's role in presidential transitions and lays out some recommendations for how OMB can, in particular, strengthen its management functions. But I'll start at the offset just by noting that OMB actually has a couple of institutional roles in transitions that are laid out in the Presidential Transition Act. The act requires a standing agency transition directors council, which is co-chaired by the Deputy Director for Management at OMB and GSA's Federal Transition Coordinator. The other members are the senior career people at the agencies who are responsible for transition activities. And during an election year, it also allows representatives of the candidates to participate in that council. And the council actually is required even to meet once a year in non-election years, and then meet more regularly during an election year. And then the OMB director also sits on the White House Transition Coordinating Council, which is a separate council established of really like senior level political people, usually cabinet secretaries, the head of GSA, OPM, and it's chaired by the White House. So OMB has those roles as a matter of reality. In the last couple of transitions, really the GSA Federal Transition Coordinator has really kind of driven the nitty gritty of the transition activities. And that's a good thing, but the law provides that person is a senior career person at GSA, so that insulates it a little bit from politics. But still, I think it's just very important for OMB to have the roles that it does to help signal to the rest of the government that transition is, an activity that requires the most senior level attention across the government. So I'm going to talk a little bit about management as an enabler of policy. I love to quote Dan Tangerlini, who I'm sure a lot of you know. He worked at OMB and eventually became the head of GSA. He actually sits on the partnerships board, and he says that the budget without management is just numbers, and management without budget is just words. And I fully agree with that. Right now, during this stage of the transition, in addition to preparing the president's first budget, the staff at OMB will also be helping to develop the president's management agenda, which traditionally is laid out also as part of the full first request of the president's budget. If you look at the president's priority areas, COVID, the economy, racial justice, climate change, these are all really incredibly complex challenges. And it involves numerous work streams over, for each of those issues, it really involves almost every agency in the government. So progress in all these areas will require strong emphasis on management from OMB and a really good coordination between the M and the B sides of OMB. And at its best, OMB can be just incredibly effective in driving results and accountability. just a couple of examples. It played a very significant role working very closely with then Vice President Biden in rolling out and implementing the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act in 2009. It had a very successful effort that it led in reducing veterans' homelessness during the Obama administration, again, coordinating all the agencies with a stake in that. And then one area where the partnership has worked very closely with OMB in recent years is in the area of customer service. OMB, again, through its collaboration role, has been able to bring agencies together. They share what they're working on, and it's been really a great example of how OMB can help drive best practices across the government. So our chapter in the book really lays out some ways that OMB could transform itself to be even more effective. The partnership interviewed over 70 experts, many of whom have worked at OMB over the years, and really identified some challenges that have persisted across administration. And in general, they are that often OMB gets trapped in its own silos. And this is not only just between the M part and the B part, but even like within the M part, a lot of times over the years, I've seen silos. And just kind of picking up on what Rachel said, it's often perceived as an agency of no, and a lot of people will call it as no OMB. And I think that's not only because of OIRA's role, but because it does have the roles of guarding the purse and also guarding the president's priorities. But it could, at the same time also kind of shift to a culture of yes and enabling agencies to do some innovative things. Often the agency just gets caught up in lower priorities. It's asked to do a lot, again, with very few people. And over the years, in general, it's been very good at issuing guidance, but less active in kind of following up on implementation of that. So our ideas are for transforming OMB, first kind of shifting the focus from just producing the budget to producing results, increasing the OMB staff. We have some guidance for OMB that we give all agencies, which is really to invest in the professional development of your staff. A lot of times across the government, people are promoted into management experience, management positions, really because of their technical expertise, but they're not trained on how to be managers. And a lot of times people kind of grow up in an agency without a chance to have experiences outside the agency or doing rotations in the private sector. And we think those are just incredibly important developmental opportunities as people kind of rise up the ranks in an agency. So if you read our chapter in the book, a lot of it kind of comes across as some tough love. But I think the good news is that there's several pieces of good news. First of all, the career staff at OMB is just incredibly talented. They're a great resource for the White House, and they really are the institutional memory of the Executive Office of the President. The president has put forth a really experienced and talented team to lead OMB, and they're hitting the ground running. And then finally, out of this crisis of this past year, there's so much opportunity that we're seeing across the government. I mean, not only did the government really successfully shift on a dime to a whole telework culture, there are all sorts of innovations going on across the government, and we're seeing this in customer service to the people. We're seeing it in how agencies do acquisitions and hiring. So OMB just really has a great opportunity to really harness all of that and to make sure that as we move beyond the pandemic, that we don't go back to the status quo. So I'll conclude with that. And again, thank you again for inviting me to participate in this. And I hope for all the students out there that you'll get excited about government management and come want to work in the federal government to make things work better.
Thank you so much, Troy, particularly for that very encouraging conclusion, which I think has certainly, I can't see how it's exciting to to see how encouraged students will be about working in government and policymaking from the level of institutional detail that we are discussing. There is so much to discuss, and to conclude our panel remarks before we move into the Q&A, I'm delighted to turn to Martha Coven. Martha, thank you for joining us. I did the formal introductions at the beginning, so if you like, we were, as we've discussed, that if you'd like to provide a kind of broader perspective on the delicate diplomacy, perhaps, between OMB and the White House, as well as generally speaking, and in recent years, as well as more recently in the transition, if you'd like. So I'll turn it over to you, Martha.
Sure, and I will be brief so that you do have plenty of time for the questions that you all have on your minds, I'm sure. I will just focus in right on the transition, because I think that's a nice way to sort of wrap up this discussion of OMB's role inside the presidency. I served actually in the Biden-Harris transition as the agency review team lead for OMB. So I was right in the middle of witnessing how this institution does indeed transition from the leadership of one president to another. I'll say just one thing about my team in that process, and then I'll have a few observations about what my takeaways were from the transition experience about the centrality of OMB's role. So first, these agency review teams, for those who don't know this piece of the transition process, it's a team of people who are basically tasked with, starting in November, although there's preparatory work before that, engaging with the agency after the election, after it's clear what the result of the election is. Obviously, there was some dispute over when it was clear, but in any case, to go in after the election, understand what's going on at the agency, and get things ready for the new leadership to take over. I had a team of 10 people working with me. Of note, 4 of those people were former career staff at OMB, which I think underscores the expertise function that career staff have and the important role that they continue to play wearing other hats, as these were people who had left the agency prior to the election. So we had a group of people who kind of, again, as soon as we could, engage with the agency staff to try to get things ready. As I said, the experience really did underscore for me the centrality of OMB's role in coordinating a president's agenda. There was scarcely a campaign promise made by President Biden and Vice President Harris that didn't have some OMB equity in it, or some implementation role for OMB. I mean, just looking across the broad array of actions that the incoming president was planning to take. People often think of the budget work, and of course that's really important, and that is something, since the president's budget is technically due the first week of February, even though in transition years presidents are always late, they try to get going as quickly as they can. We encountered some difficulties in getting the political leadership under the Trump administration to cooperate with us in that historic function. I'll come back to that at the end. But that's sort of the obvious thing is, yeah, you have a budget to prepare. This is a budget agency, get going on that. But the management function, which Troy just mentioned, is also one that's very cross-cutting, particularly in an era of crises like the COVID crisis, the cybersecurity problems that the government was experiencing. There's a whole array of things where the management side of OMB was involved. And we also were trying as much as possible to set up the new teams so that there was good budget management integration, which has been a frequent critique of OMB. So we were trying to do some things to make sure that those parts of OMB were better aligned going into a new presidency. The regulatory work, of course, there is a Biden-Harris agenda, an executive action agenda, some of which involves entirely new rulemakings, some of which involves modifying or even reversing actions taken by the Trump administration where they differ, and they don't always, but where they differ with the direction that a Biden-Harris agenda might go. And then speaking of executive actions, there's not just regulations, but there are executive orders, which are these solely presidential actions. One of the things that we discovered, and perhaps others knew this, I didn't, is that ordinarily OMB's general counsel's office performs the function of kind of basically overseeing the process by which an EO is reviewed and finalized. And there's a Kennedy era executive order that lays that out. That function had been taken out of the OMB general counsel's office during the Trump administration. And so one of the structural things we had to do was, first of all, provide a recommendation about whether it should go back. And then once, assuming the decision was made to put it back into OMB, figure out how structurally all those steps needed to be put back together so that a concept, something could get from concept as an executive order all the way through the process steps that you need for it to get onto the president's desk and be signed. And as you saw, President Biden had a bunch of out-of-the-box executive orders that he was signing, and so there was a lot of work done inside the transition to make sure that those were in good shape. And again, with OMB having so many equities in so many parts of government, part of what my team was doing was assessing those executive orders to make sure that the assignments given to OMB and the timeframes and so on made sense. So again, OMB threaded throughout the work of a new president getting ready to take over. So I will say I'm not the only person for whom the centrality of OMB's role was reaffirmed in this process. I think the outgoing director, Russ Vought, who was appointed by President Trump, also appreciated that centrality. And I think that may be part of what led him to severely restrict the access that the transition had to career staff in a break with a longstanding tradition on the budget going back to Eisenhower, where there's cooperation on developing a new president's budget during transition. He severely curtailed our access to the staff for analytical purposes, and even wrote a quite strident public letter, which was posted on social media and elsewhere. And I'll quote, this is on New Year's Eve, I'll just quote a few lines from this quote: "What we have not done and will not do is use current OMB staff to write the Biden transition team's legislative policy proposals to dismantle this administration's work." And it goes on and on. So I think that the idea was, wow, OMB is really powerful. I have this asset. I want to hang on to it until the last possible moment, which is the stroke of noon on January 20th. We were able to engage with OMB, of course, but not in the traditional extensive manner, I think, again, because it was such a prized asset and one that the incumbent administration was so reluctant to share with the transition. So I will stop there and look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Martha, and thank you to all of our panelists. We have raised a number of topics for discussion. I'm tempted to ask several questions, but what I think I'm going to do is ask one, and then I'll see if anyone on the panel would like to raise a question. We have another distinguished contributor to our volume, Jim Pfiffner, I saw was in the audience. And Jim, if you have a question, I think we'll turn to you first in the audience for a question if you'd like. So we'll do that in a minute. We're going to open the chat box. But Jim, if you'd like to unmute, that would be fine as well in a second. And then after that, we'll open it up for questions overall. My question, and I'm doing this in part on behalf of my class, though I have several others that I'd like to ask, but an assignment that my students are working on this weekend is comparing the inaugural addresses from 2017 and 2021 and looking at the messages and implications for policymaking. And they're going to incorporate our discussion today and some of the readings from the volume. As all of you were speaking, and I guess I'll pick up on Martha, the last point about the centrality of OMB's role, right, in policymaking. Each of you spoke about how agencies interact, right, with either within OMB or institutions with OMB. So Capitol Hill, transition teams, internal regulation. Would you speak, if any of you would like to address this, how much OMB responds to public communications? And actually this kind of picks up on the last point, either from the White House or executive administration officials, and to what degree OMB and other institutions influence those communications for policymaking. So I hope that's not too big of a question. If anyone wants to respond? Oh no, if the panel won't respond, then how are my students going to write a paper on this?
So I'll say a couple of things, which is there's a lot of variation, I think, if we think about the regulatory process and how different things have developed over time. Sometimes OMB has really gone out and tried to, post a guidance document and say, give us your feedback and we'll respond to it. And that's, I think, considered a best practice. And one thing I mentioned was the commitment from the President Biden's modernizing the regulatory process memo, to revising that A4 guidance, which is about cost benefit analysis. And so I think one of the things that we're looking for and hoping for is that there's going to be a lot of consultation with different stakeholders, right? A lot of people have really defined expertise in this area. So there's a lot of expertise out there in the public among like academics and economists, and also stakeholders who are, you know, sometimes suing agencies about these rules. So there's a lot of hope, and I think an expectation that there will be public consultation for that kind of thing.
Thank you.
I'll just add one interesting thing I learned when I was on Capitol Hill is that OMB also plays the role like reviewing all the congressional testimony before it goes to the Hill to make sure it's aligned with the president's views and priorities. And I always felt sorry for the agencies because when their testimony was late, it was usually because it was at OMB, but they couldn't really say that because they didn't want to throw OMB over the bus. But I think that's just another, you know, good example of like how OMB just touches about, you know, everything. And, you know, it's reinforcing Martha's point about it being so central to everything.
Thank you, Troy. Are there any questions from the panel? Any topics to raise?
I have a question for Martha, actually, if she can answer it. And this is really about the broad, I mean, her observations and that of the review team, you know, for the sort of state of the agency at the moment. There's a lot of press about sort of demoralization. You know, this has been an agency that, you know, has prided itself on neutral competence, on being able to serve president after president of different parties, to be able to shift on a dime, and frankly, to be able to be writing legislation with one hand and then writing the legislation that would demolish that legislation on the other. Something that, as you mentioned, the former director refused to allow to happen during the transition, at least, again, according to press reports. So I guess my question is whether you know, how much needs to be done to sort of rebuild capacity at OMB. Clearly, the Trump administration did draw heavily on its expertise in figuring out, you know, things like government shutdowns or how to implement national emergencies or shift money from pot to pot, you know, and how not to spend money on Ukraine, perhaps even. But the, you know, what needs to be done really in the new administration to make OMB work as well as it can?
Yeah, it's a good question. I will say I think we found OMB in, on one level, better shape than a lot of people have imagined that it would be, which I think is a testament to the resilience and professionalism of the people who work there. One of the very first call that we did once we were allowed by the GSA administrator to engage was with Mark Sandy, who was the career official who got dragged into the impeachment mess. And he was literally still standing. He did his call standing. And I will never forget seeing him on the Zoom screen thinking, if Mark Sandy is still standing, you know, the entity, the agency is intact. I mean, there are parts of the agency, I think, where they experienced more staff losses than others. So it's a little bit uneven. I will say, though, that I think that the toughest thing there have been two really tough things for the agency in the last year. One of which has abated and one of which is ongoing. The one that has abated is this threat of this Schedule F reclassification of civil servants such that it makes it easier to terminate them. That was a policy introduced by the Trump administration in the fall, and that was really difficult for people who were trying to do their jobs, but under this new threat of potentially being terminated. That's gone, that policy's ended. The second one is managing the COVID volume of work on top of everything else. There's so much going on. And so the pandemic is not only stressful for all of us who are trying to juggle all the aspects of life, if we even have work to hang on to, and luckily the professionals on this call do, but it also created work for people at OMB managing the response to the crisis. And what we frequently heard from people is, we're all home and we're trying to manage this national crisis. And I think that created its own extra level of burden. But I would say overall, I think the institution is intact and the people there are doing great work and will continue to. And of course, there's rebuilding that needs to be done. But my observation isn't that it was hollowed out or so severely damaged that it isn't the OMB that people remember.
Thank you, Andy. Thank you, Martha. We have opened the chat for questions. And you can, I'm just trying to, I have two screens going here. So I'm trying to see if a question comes into the chat, you can send it directly to me or to the full group. Either one is fine. Just let us know who they're for. If you do the raise hand feature, I think I can see if someone would like to speak. And just second, let me just see what is, I just saw a hand and it disappeared. So, well, while we're waiting for questions to come in, let me ask one. And what I guess I'll direct this one to Molly. As we prepare for not just the passage of the coronavirus, the relief package that you mentioned, but also the fiscal year 22 budget. And we're waiting to see, I thought the State of the Union address was confirmed for February 23rd, but I think that's since been left open, at least when I checked yesterday, it wasn't confirmed. Molly, would you say a little bit about the interaction or OMB's role in navigating the White House priorities with the message, the budget message that follows the President's State of the Union address, and how that starts the annual budgetary process, and maybe what some of the unique challenges or may be this year?
Sure. So a couple things. Generally, again, we think of the president's budget as like an articulated set of the president's budgetary priorities. And I'm really emphasizing sort of the president here because it goes to Congress. And even when Congress is controlled by the same party as the White House, which it is right now, you may or may not find the members of Congress and the president's party agreeing with what the president wants to do. And this goes everything from kind of the shape of the priorities, like what's the White House if the White House could wave a magic wand and make Congress act on something, what would it want them to act on first versus later? Congress may have different ideas about that. And then it flows all the way down into like specific programmatic decisions. So there were, thinking back to the Trump administration, for example, there were a number of programs where the Trump administration sent a budget to the Hill that said, we want to really make huge cuts in this program, and congressional appropriators said, nope, we disagree. Even Republican appropriators said, we want to keep the funds flowing. So that's kind of the big picture. I think in this particular year, we do have this kind of interesting sequencing. We have this effort, again, as we speak, to move a big relief package quickly. Congress is doing that through a set of procedures that have some limits to them. You can't do anything you want through the budget reconciliation process. Probably and it's not always clear when you go in what you can and can't do. So probably the policy issue that folks may have seen some reporting on is the question of whether you can use the reconciliation process to increase the federal minimum wage. It's an open debate right now. And so we have this effort to do a big package really quickly. And then it remains to be seen how much of what Biden has articulated as part of the American Rescue Plan, I believe is what the White House is calling it, how much of that can fit into this initial legislative vehicle versus how much of it is left over. There's also important kind of congressional timing pieces here. There's for example, cliff in the expanded unemployment insurance benefits that will kick in at the end of March, I believe. So there's all kinds of moving parts, but it really does kind of, I think, reflect this general dynamic where the president will often lay out priorities and then may find that Congress does or does not want to share them, take them up from, again, the big picture, even down to relatively small detailed choices.
Thank you, Molly. And I would like to ask a follow-up, but we've actually got several questions in the chat. There were two that are public, but there were two that came in from students. So let me go in order. The first question, and this could really be for anybody on the panel, but I think Andy, given your work on legislative programs, maybe I'll turn to you first. The question is, how does polarization in Congress directly impact the OMB? How will this COVID relief? Is there any way to combat this?
Yeah, so OMB's role in the legislative process is largely in formulating the president's legislative program or helping to oversee and coordinate that through the Legislative Reference Division. That's shifted over time to the point where, presidents used to really have a formal set of draft legislation that would be sent over, via special message or other mechanisms to Congress directly. Over time, that has shifted somewhat to presidents, issuing sort of bullet points. Here are the things we would like to see you include, and sort of sometimes the anecdote that tells that tale is, President Clinton sent over 1,300 pages of a healthcare reform bill, whereas President Obama sent over, here are some important points that should be included, and worked, allowed Congress really to do the drafting side of that. My understanding is that at some point, the status of administration legislation that I showed you in the presentation was actually suspended to a degree because there was little presidential legislation, but that I think has been restored, though Martha may know more about that. So in terms of the polarization, OMB is helping with what agencies are producing, right? Trying to keep track of presidential priorities. They are tracking what's happening in Congress closely. And that's something that is sort of in conjunction with the White House Office of Legislative Affairs. And of course, as I mentioned, trying to figure out the White House / administration position on legislation as it comes to a vote. So OMB's, in terms of polarization, they're tracking it, I think, more than being affected by it in a direct sense. But Molly or Jim actually may want to chime in on that.
Well, we actually have about 5 more questions right now. So if it's okay, I'll keep going. But if anyone would like to speak, please just, let me know, unmute, and that's fine. The second question that came directly to me, I think is probably for Troy and Martha. How has the coronavirus pandemic affected how did that affect the transition for the OMB? And what was done to mitigate those challenges? So Troy or Martha, if either of you would like to address, or both?
I think I would defer to Martha, just since she had the firsthand experience being on an agency review team.
Yeah, I guess I would say it maybe in 2 ways, but well, probably more than 2. But the 2 that come to mind are, of course, the transition was virtual. I never entered that building. The only people who really went into government offices were those who needed to access classified information and be in what they call a SCIF, but otherwise we were entirely virtual. So ordinarily you would be physically interacting with people, and instead it was just, one Google Meet meeting after another. But the second way is that it was the dominant issue. And it reminded me a little bit of what, I didn't serve on the 08-09 transition, but I think it in the same way that the global financial meltdown was the dominant issue in the Bush to Obama transition, the dominant issue in this one was COVID, because nothing else works until we get this pandemic under control. And as we've all said, OMB has so many kind of plugs into the work that needs to be done to address the pandemic that kept folks very busy, including the career staff doing their ongoing work serving President Trump and implementing enacted legislation for him, as we were also trying to work with them to set things up for the future.
Thank you, Martha. There are a few questions that have come in for everyone. I think maybe Rachel, if I could ask you to address this one, given your work in OMB and then as a scholar of OMB, so from inside and the outside, how influenced is OMB by the public, given that it is staffed with non-elected officials and it performs important oversight over other non-elected bureaucrats?
Sure. Well, I'll talk about this from the regulatory side, which is really my area of expertise, and then if others want to weigh in on other aspects of OMB. But OMB doesn't, or WIRA doesn't engage with the public. I mentioned, sometimes these process issues that are really important to a lot of people might be a point of engagement. But when we talk about public engagement in rulemaking, that's really individuals and entities submitting comments to agencies. And OIRA's role is to make sure that the agencies took those comments seriously and really thought and deliberated about what the public said about a policy an agency is proposing. So OMB has an oversight role in making sure that that function worked well at the agencies, that people's voices were heard. OIRA does meet with members of interested parties in about rulemaking. So there is a way that you as a stakeholder could ask to meet with OIRA about a regulation that was under review. Most evidence suggests that corporations and sort of organized interests are much better at knowing how to access that. OIRA has a policy where they don't comment or engage with those in those meetings and like really say, oh, that's a good point or that's a bad point. They just listen. But the people that know to request them tend to be sort of better heeled groups is what the research has shown over time. So it's not like, your grandma is getting to meet with OIRA very often. And I don't think that's very surprising. But so the role is mostly an oversight role generally in engaging the public.
Thank you, Rachel. If there's no one else that has a comment, I'm going to move to the next question. Martha, this was addressed to you, and I think Andy might want to speak about it as well regarding oversight of executive orders. The question specifically was, is oversight now back at OMB's General Counsel's office? Which office was doing it in the Trump administration?
So my understanding is that it was being done out of the White House counsel's office during the Trump administration, and that it has returned to OMB's General Counsel's office, but I can't 100% confirm that. That's my understanding. I don't know, Andy or others, if you know for sure.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly much more influence from the White House counsel in the Trump administration process than previously. I don't know if it ever formally left technically the General Counsel's office, but it was certainly not as clean a process or in terms of where it was centered as in prior administrations. And, I would imagine it would return to regular order, as it were. But yeah, I guess the proof will be in the pudding there. Certainly one thing you saw in the Trump administration was this expansion of sort of press release prefaces to executive orders, which were not particularly common before. That have shrunk down somewhat in the Biden administration, though they are still present, I think, in some of those orders to a degree. By the way, can I make one addendum to my earlier answer on the legislative process, which is only to say, obviously, one of the things OMB cares a lot about is the appropriations process and those bills. And so one impact of polarization, not solely of polarization, has been the decline of regular order on the floor and the sort of disintegration of the traditional budget calendar over time, which has certainly had an effect on the way OMB does its work. Probably not a positive thing overall for legislating or for tracking it.
Thank you. That ties in just to what we were discussing earlier. So with the budget process. So thank you, Andy, and thank you, Martha. Two more questions that have come in directly to me. I think maybe this one, Molly, I think I'll direct this to you and then see if anyone else would like to add as well. What is OMB's standard process to prioritize budget requests and funding decisions? Does this process look different depending on who is in the office? And so I know you're approaching this from the Capitol Hill perspective, but I think, again, just that interaction of prioritizing requests and decisions and how appointments affect that process.
Yeah, so I can't really speak to kind of what happens within OMB. That's not my my area of expertise. But I will just say on the broader point about kind of how does Congress decide what to do with the priorities that come to it from the White House. That's ever-present tension, whether Congress, particularly one controlled by the same party as the president, shares the same urgent priorities as the White House does. I mean, Andy mentioned before, kind of in passing, the fact that like the Trump White House by the end had very little in the way of a legislative program that it was working on. And so when folks ask me, like, what are the big differences between the Biden administration and the Trump administration vis-a-vis Congress, one of the kind of overlooked ones, it's not just the sort of massive change in policy preferences, but also just the degree to which the current White House is and will be going forward, both sort of at an idea level and the practical level, engaged in the legislative process.
Thank you, Martha. We have a question from one of our co-contributors to the volume, Jim Pfiffner. And Jim, I don't know if you can, I'm going to try to, I just requested that you unmute. So if you'd like to speak.
Yeah, these have been fascinating presentations, but I particularly would like to, Martha, who gave a very, I think, restrained description of what happened with OMB and the transition. Because in thinking, in writing about presidential transitions for the last several decades, OMB has usually been very responsive to an incoming administration. And I particularly remember in 1980 and 81, and I was in the director's office at the Office of Personnel Management, and Stockman really got a lot of cooperation, it seemed, from the outgoing Carter administration and the Cribb people at OMB. So would you say a little bit more, give us a little more context of the kind of resistance that you got this time?
Sure. So, I mean, as you all probably know, first of all, there was a several-week delay in the GSA acknowledging what most others believed, which was that President Biden had indeed been elected president of the United States. But that was government-wide. Once that ascertainment happened, agencies sort of set about this, engaging in this more normal practice of transition, which is governed now by a framework of laws and, of course, longstanding practices and traditions. And the level, how agency leaders, meaning the political appointees, chose to engage in that was somewhat uneven across government. There were a number of pockets of maybe what I would call resistance across government, not just at OMB, at several places. Over time, most of those issues got worked out, and the remaining really difficult situations were largely at two agencies, the Department of Defense and the Office of Management and Budget. And the decision that and there wasn't really, I mean, I think one of the takeaways maybe for future Congresses thinking about this legislation otherwise is there wasn't a great mechanism for addressing the lack of cooperation, right? What court do you take this to? That wasn't the kind of circumstance we were in, right? So the incumbent leadership took a very narrow interpretation of what the transition laws required them to do, and essentially instructed the civil servants at OMB not to provide any analytical support to us. So whether that was on a management matter or a regulatory matter or a budget analysis, nothing. We could talk to them and ask factual questions and understand the state of staffing at the agencies and some of those things, but they couldn't help us with anything analytic. And of course, we were facing multiple crises and wanting to get going on things, and we just didn't have the traditional access to them. And that was, I think, really unfortunate for the country, unfortunate for the people who work at OMB who are eager to make for a smooth transition and hit the ground running, because that agenda was going to happen regardless of what the policy preferences were of the incumbent leadership. So I think it was a loss for the American people. The other thing that they did, I guess, that was somewhat unusual, and I don't know how much this was the case at other agencies, they kept up quite a high volume of activity. Now, in the regulatory domain, that's somewhat standard, right? You kind of get your things done until the deadlines run out, as Rachel may have said. But they did things like prepare a big rescission request of funds that they knew that the Biden-Harris administration supported being made available. They knew Congress didn't agree with this rescission request, and yet one of their very late activities was to put together this big rescission package. So there were some things that just seemed like a waste of, frankly, taxpayer resources, the time spent by people putting together these packages that were clearly going nowhere. So I think it was a real unfortunate set of decisions that didn't serve the American people. And I hope we learn from that transition cooperation needs to be more clearly required, and that norm needs to be reestablished going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Martha. We are almost out of time, but there was one more question that came to me, and I'll just pose it to the group, whoever would like to address it, from a student in my class. Do most directors and deputy directors work their way up from lower roles in OMB or in other institutions such as Capitol Hill? Student references, of course, nominee Shalonda Young, or are they pulled from different places?
They're pulled from lots of places. I don't know if people on Capitol Hill would consider it a promotion to go work for the president necessarily. In any case, yeah, you'd almost have to go person by person, but frequently they will come out of, they come out of party politics in the broadest sense, but will often have a technical background. They may come from a department or agency. David Stockman, who Jim Fiffner mentioned, came from Congress, sort of a very young and energetic budget wonk at the time. His successor was sort of a think tank person. His successor was a former congressman who again had worked on the budget committee. So there is definitely some Capitol Hill executive office interaction here, but others have come from management positions in other government agencies or in the private sector. Director Vaught came from Heritage Foundation, sort of again, think tank orientation. And again, they're partisan, but part of their job is to be analytic and to imbue this notion of neutral competence, sort of serving as the political lightning rod in a way for the agency, oftentimes, so that the careerists and the analysis can continue without effectively political interference. So there is a rationale for this sort of political career divide, and the buffering, indeed, that the sort of from the pad level up can help provide to those who are doing the broader work of the agency. Anyway, so lots of places that they come from. Sometimes deputy directors do become directors, but I wouldn't say often people are promoted from within. Just sort of off the top of my head.
We are out of time. I regret that we have to conclude, but I am glad that we are concluding on a note of cooperation, point that was made, and neutral competence. Andy, I'm glad you were able to bring up that very important term that really, I think, is probably most links OMB between scholars and the public, a phrase that is known. Many thanks to the audience for joining us today. Please join me in thanking our panelists, Andrew Rudelevige, Molly Reynolds, Rachel Potter, Troy Cribb, and Martha Coven. We greatly appreciate your time. This was such an instructive discussion. There will be a recording that will be sent to all people who were on the, who were registered for the event, and we will make that available on the Hofstra website as soon as it is ready for that. So with that, my great thanks to everyone, and have a wonderful, I think we're seeing all the lovely messages that are coming in. Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon.